Okay, so I have a few instances here on bars 25 through 26. Okay, on the first one you notice that there's an unusual 5 and 3 tuplet. Now how did I get that? Well, when I was initially hearing this music, I thought I kept hearing as 5 pulse. But it was a bit different. It was a normal beat. Instead of I heard, and you notice that the middle beat is a bit longer. And the next bar had something similar but kept getting muddled by the quarter notes above it. More about that one later. So over time I noticed that the pulse and the tuplets were equal, so I started making the middle note longer, and it didn't make much sense anymore when I realized they were even. So I used a 5 and 3. 5 even pulses in the span of 3 beats. The next measure was trickier. Please note that this measure has a normal beat, unlike the last measure. At first I had dissonance to worry about because anytime dissonance happens between two voices, it reduces the clarity of some of the notes. And it really startled me because the quarter notes were supposed to play the loudest, and yet the dissonant pulse below and right had a pulsating build coming through. Like a crowd clap getting louder and louder till anyone trying to speak becomes muffled. So at first I stopped the pulse before I reached the quarter notes, letting it ring like so. But that wasn't quite it. I tried giving it a 5 and 3 tuplet, but it was just so slightly off. On the sheet, the quarter notes would happen dead center between the 4th and 5th pulse of the tuplet. But on the recording I heard the slightest delay, so that timing was wrong. Besides, the 5th pulse was indistinguishable from the 4th unless you were tapping to it, so I went back to a normal beat and just let the pulse play out faster than I did in the previous bar. Simple. I wasn't until then that I finally got the sound of pulses, beats, and oscillations out of my head that I was about to hear the pulse with no tap. It was just a long note. So it could have worked without them, and they could have just been dotted half notes. Whether the F sharp should have been tied had I done it that way, I can't be sure. It's like distinguishing the transition from upstroke to downstroke on a violin without being able to see it. It's like sliding a spoon around a bowl and trying to count how many times it goes around, using nothing but poor audio with background sound of sliding chairs. Maybe it would have been or straight and tied. But I refused to do that because the sense of pulse was still there regardless, and the worst thing I could do was ignore it. The pulse was quiet, but it wasn't dying down. Long piano notes tend to die down, so giving them a pulse is a good way to keep the notes alive. That's why I ended up doing this. I also like this one bit in effect regarding comedic timing, for lack of a better word. The metronome doesn't change, but the pulse does get faster from one bar to the next, and the pulse intensifies. The transition from a lot of long notes to a lot of short notes, if you check out the surrounding bars. It was a well-placed moment in the episode in question too, to have a more unusual pulse for comedic timing and then revert to a normal but faster, more intense pulse, almost as if it's a train going from chugging to expressway speed. Now, I also want to talk about this chord up here. In the track, this is really just a percussion. You could probably get about the same sound from clashing pots, but I'm not destroying dishes, so I'm making a chord instead. I kept replaying the sound, trying to approximate the clash as closely as I can. I only had a one-pitch pulse establishing below it, so there wasn't really much to worry about whether or not the clash would muffle the other notes. As long as they were distant enough, which they were, the clash chord was free to be anything. I started with this right here. It's great that it was just one clash, because if not, I'd usually have to play from the beginning and check each note 70 plus times and then adjust it. One thing about music is that the preceding pitch can affect how you hear the current note, which is why I like to base the makeshift percussion pitches on the key signature or the chord that's currently playing. Unity and consistency and all, but not always. percussion is so irregular that when I assign a piano pitch to each tap, I often have to compare it with the previous note. And then I play the song from the very beginning, and the note doesn't work. It's like this. They doesn't fit well. And then you have dissonance and crowding and playability to worry about, so good thing I didn't have to do it here, but I still had to settle one thing. Now, there used to be a G natural note here too, so there would have been 3 clashing notes here instead of 2, which in this case I had an F and G flat. I had to choose which of the 3 to remove because the high notes above wasn't coming through, and I knew the bottom note had to stay there because it pinned the minimum of the range, while the high note pinned the maximum pitch. The 2 clashing notes in between were more difficult to choose, but I figured the best thing to do is to keep the most dissonant one, the one that you could hear and think, that's an ugly sound, and the option I had were either F, G, C, or F, G flat, C. And whichever one sounded more clashing and wrong was the one I'd choose. Knowing about suspended second chords, I knew the G natural was out because it sounded too much like a pleasant chord. 2 semitones together sound worse than 2 whole tones together, and so the decision was settled. F, G flat, C. And let me just move over to a few pages back. Then preceding these 2 bars, there's all these long notes which made finding the beats per minute tricky. And there's some triplets here, alternating time signatures there. This one note used to cover the span of 11 eighth notes before I gave it a fermata. And this whole note here used to be a triplet eighth shorter. But after trying between triplet time, duple time, odd time, it was impractical, so I just made it a whole. Any song with uneven long notes is going to be like this, especially when there's a pickup bar in the beginning and a fermata elsewhere. When I do find a BPM that works for one bar, I have an urge to maintain it for every bar before it, and when one bar doesn't work with it, it distracts me. I found out that the pickup note wasn't an entire beat long, which made it tricky because the closest regular beats wasn't until after those 2 bars from go. The second chord in the song made it trickier because it came in quietly and louder, with a new pitch entering at the apex of it. Detecting where to place it took a while to align, what with the constant switching among BPM. Anyway, the final song is done and you can play it with a metronome, or not.